Experienced journalist named Corey Hutchins has just published a scoop at Medium.com about Congress and the military and something that is not supposed to happen between Congress and the military. The member of Congress at the center of this scoop is Doug Lamborn. He's a conservative Republican congressman from a conservative Republican district in Colorado. And on Tuesday this week, he was speaking at a campaign forum. Apparently, it was held in the basement of a bar in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And we've got tape of this. I should tell you, we've got multiple sources for the tape on this because we wanted to make sure it really happened. We did get a video, which appears to be from a campaign tracker, but we didn't just want to go with that one source. We also then got audio tape of the same event from a different source. And it turns out the two tapes, as best as we can tell, they match exactly. So with those two sources, we think this really did happen as it appears to have happened. It's in response to a question about the military and whether Doug Lamborn, as a member of Congress, supports the military adequately. And in response to that question, as you'll hear on the tape, the congressman explains that he and others, he sort of implied that it was him and other members of Congress. He said he and others were actively working right now behind the scenes to try to get multiple generals from the U.S. military to resign from the military. Doug Lamborn is a member of the House Armed Services Committee. He's on the subcommittee on readiness, which is all about U.S. military training and being prepared for war. He's on the subcommittee on strategic forces. And that congressman says that he is right now actively working to try to get U.S. generals to quit the military in what he calls a, quote, blaze of glory. So watch this. This starts with a question from the audience, a questioner who, I should tell you, is very hostile to President Obama. But then Congressman Lamborn gives his answer. Watch.
Please work with your other congressmen on both sides of the aisle and support the generals and the troops in this country, despite the fact that there is no leadership from the Muslim Brotherhood in the White House.
Not necessarily a question, a statement takes place.
You know what? I can't add anything to that, but do let me reassure you on this. A lot of us are talking to the generals behind the scenes, saying, "Hey, if you disagree with the policy that the White House has given you, let's have a resignation. Let's have a public resignation and state your protests and go out in a blaze of glory." And I haven't seen that very much. In fact, I haven't seen that at all in years.
Again, this is a serving member of Congress, Republican congressman. He's a member of the Armed Services Committee in the House. He made those remarks this week. The tape emerged today. He says that he and others are working behind the scenes, talking to generals, trying to persuade them to quit the military. Not incidentally, he's saying he's doing that while we are at war in 3 countries. There are about 29,000 Americans serving in Afghanistan right now. There are more than 1,500 Americans serving in Iraq, where American pilots and military aircraft have flown more than 200 airstrikes in Iraq in recent weeks. Now, dozens of airstrikes as well in Syria, in a new air war that spans both those countries, alongside the existing ground war still being fought in Afghanistan. And in the middle of all that, serving members of U.S. Congress on the Armed Services Committee are trying to get U.S. generals to quit, because that would be a blaze of glory. We contacted Congressman Lamborn's office today for comment or an explanation. I mean, what he said leaves some outstanding questions. Congressman Lamborn, if you would ever like to talk directly to me about this, I would really welcome the opportunity. Questions I still have include, which generals has Congressman Lamborn been trying to persuade to quit the military? Are any of those generals actively involved right now in planning for or training for or actively fighting in the war we are in Afghanistan right now, or the war we're in Iraq, or the war we're in Syria? When Congressman Lamborn says, quote, a lot of us are talking to generals about quitting behind the scenes, telling them to resign, who do you mean by a lot of us? Are there other members of Congress who are working on this plan? Is it other members of the Armed Services Committee? Is it Republicans and Democrats? Is it just Republicans? As a member of Congress, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, as somebody from a military-heavy district in Colorado, Congressman Lamborn, do you believe it would be good for the military and in the best interest of the United States, especially in wartime, for lots of generals to start quitting right now for apparently political reasons? We were not able to reach Congressman Lamborn himself today, but we did speak to his office. And what the Congressman's communication director told us today was this. The Congressman's communication director told us, quote, what the Congressman was saying there, he was not referring to any current actions. He told us that when Congressman Lamborn said he's contacting U.S. generals to try to get them to quit, he was not describing, quote, any kind of active or habitual or organized endeavor. When we asked specifically if Congressman Lamborn had encouraged generals to resign and when he did that, the spokesman said, quote, I can't speak to that, but the quotation making the rounds is referring to things in the past. To be clear, again, the congressman said this on Tuesday.
A lot of us are talking to the generals behind the scenes saying, hey, if you disagree with the policy that the White House has given you, let's have a resignation.
Now, because the god of politics is also the god of irony, it should be noted that although Doug Lamborn is in a fairly conservative Republican-leaning district in Colorado, he does have a strong opponent this November as he campaigns on basically trying to incite mutiny among America's generals during wartime. And it turns out his opponent is a retired Air Force Major General who spent 32 years in the service. He's a conservative Democrat with the memorable name of Irv Halter. General Halter has already put out a response to Congressman Lamborn on this issue. He told the Colorado Independent, it is inappropriate for Congressman Lamborn to politicize our military for his own gain. Our elected officials should not be encouraging military leaders to resign. Congressman Lamborn's statement shows his immaturity and lack of understanding of the American Armed Forces. Someone who served on the House Armed Services Committee should know better. Now, at one level, maybe this is just a misstatement. Maybe this is just a gaffe. I do not know Congressman Doug Lamborn's track record in politics well enough to know if he's the kind of guy who should be expected to just accidentally say something that's totally nuclear, but he doesn't really believe it and he didn't really mean to say it. We don't know that much about him on the national stage. The only way he's ever really been nationally noticed before in his 8 years in Congress was when he tried to get Congress to defund NPR. So who knows? Maybe Congressman Lamborn did mean it, or maybe Republicans in the House Armed Services Committee are en masse trying to incite mutiny in the military. Because that's the prospect he raised, this deserves a little elaboration. A lot of people may have some follow-up questions on these matters. So that's the death of the Republic news from this side of the war. Our great allies, the Brits, actually recalled their parliament out of recess today in order for them to have a full-fledged, proper debate and a binding vote about whether the British military would start participating in this military campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. British planes have thus far been flying surveillance routes over Iraq to help with the supposedly humanitarian part of the mission against ISIS, but they have not been participating in any hostilities against ISIS targets thus far because their version of Congress, their parliament, had not authorized them to do that. Well, today, after a very, very good and entertaining debate, the parliament voted by a large margin that they would give that military authorization.
How long will this war last, and when will Mission Creep start?
Well, let me answer that very directly. This is going to be a mission that will take not just months, but years.
Killing extremists doesn't kill their ideas. To the contrary, it can often feed their ideas.
We've also got to think of the consequences of inaction. How much stronger will they be before we decide we need to take action as well?
Look at what the House of Commons agreed to. Iraq, Afghanistan, in this government, Libya, none are success stories.
We do have to realise that whether we like it or not, they have already declared war on us.
Why is it right to carry out such actions against ISIS in Iraq, but not in Syria? The government has welcomed the action carried out by the United States and other Arab countries in Syria in recent days. If it is to be welcomed and right by others, why is it not welcome and right for us?
The words on the motion are about bombing Iraq. If there's a consensus in here that we're going to soon be bombing Syria, the words don't mention boots on the ground, but there's a consensus here that there will be boots on the ground. The only question being, whose boots are they?
After that full-blown, robust, formal debate today in the British Parliament, they took a vote And the parliament voted overwhelmingly that Britain should join the military campaign against ISIS. The vote was 524 to 43. It's an overwhelming vote. But the motion they voted on was really specific. It's air war only, no ground troops, and it is Iraq only and not Syria. And you heard that they were debating that point quite intensely. But that line was drawn essentially as a legal matter rather than a matter of strategy. The British Labour Party in particular argued that an air war in Iraq would be legal because it was at the request of the Iraqi government, but because the Syrian government doesn't want other countries launching airstrikes on their territory, they have not invited it. The opposition in Britain argued that no war in Syria would be legal without authorization from the United Nations, which of course does not exist. Well, the United Nations exists. The permission from the United Nations does not. It's an interesting question, not just for Britain, but for us as well, right? The question of the legality of either or both of these wars. That said, our Congress is not debating whether or not to authorize these wars. We're just doing these wars without any pesky politics getting in the way. Except apparently in Colorado, where at least one Republican member of the Armed Services Committee is trying to get the generals to quit. In Oklahoma yesterday, there was an incident of workplace violence that, while very, very tragic, it never would have become a national story had it not been for the tactic chosen by the disgruntled employee who decided to kill one of his fellow co-workers and then try to kill another. 30-year-old Alton Nolan was released from prison last year in Oklahoma. He had a long criminal history. He was employed at Vaughn Foods in Moore, Oklahoma. And if that town name is familiar, it's because, yes, that is the same town that was devastated by a huge tornado in May of last year. It was previously hit by another devastating tornado in May of 1999. And now Moore, Oklahoma is the site of this workplace killing that has resonated across the country in a way most incidents of workplace violence do not, because the way that Alton Nolan killed one of his co-workers and apparently tried to kill a second was with a knife, and in the fatal attack, he cut off his victim's head. Moore, Oklahoma police called in the FBI for assistance in dealing with this case. The alleged perpetrator is in custody. He was shot by an Oklahoma County Reserve deputy who happened to work at the plant where the attack took place, but he survived. The local police say they brought in the FBI on this case essentially because of motive and tactics. Because the alleged perpetrator was a Muslim who was said by co-workers to be trying to convert people in the workplace to Islam, and because, further, this attack follows the recent very highly publicized beheadings of hostages by the terrorist group ISIS in Syria. This week by a group that pledges allegiance to ISIS in Algeria as well. The man who was killed by the group in Algeria was a 55-year-old French tourist. Before he was killed, France, as a nation, was already on board with the U.S. military campaign against ISIS in Iraq, but not in Syria. In the wake of the beheading of their own citizen in Algeria, France is now reportedly considering expanding its national authorization for its military to also include strikes in Syria and not just in Iraq. Now, there's no indication from any local authorities in Oklahoma or from any national security sources at all that the fired employee who allegedly went on this brutal rampage today in Moore, Oklahoma, who killed one of his co-workers by beheading her and who tried to kill somebody else, there's no indication that he has any overt links to any terrorist groups or that he was thought to be carrying out instructions from anyone else. But beheading is a tactic that screams not murder, but terrorism, no matter where it is done or for whatever insane or mundane reason. And in that mix, right, the worry now is what happens to a national debate that so far has been either inane or non-existent, or in the case of Congressman Doug Lamborn, basically unbelievable. Does the continuing influence of terror, just the feeling of being scared, does that threaten to make our decisions and our debates about these issues worse and worse and worse before they ever have a chance of getting better? Joining us now is NBC News foreign correspondent Ayman Mohaldin. Ayman, thank you for being here. It's nice to see you.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thanks, Rachel.
I'm not going to ask you to talk about Congressman Doug Lamborn. We're going to wait to hear from him. Don't worry. But I do want to ask you about Iraq and Syria. The British Parliament voted today to join the airstrikes inside Iraq, but not Syria. France is already in Iraq. They may be willing to go to Syria now, too. The Belgians and the Dutch, others are joining in. As these European countries either join the coalition or decide to get further into their involvement, is that going to make a material difference in terms of what can be done against ISIS?
Well, from a military perspective, the short answer is the U.S. could have gone this alone. They have the military capability to sustain this operation. Quite frankly, the presence of those European allies is important symbolically and is going to alleviate some pressure on the U.S. They're not going to make the difference in the fight. But it's a coalition. It shows an international willingness. There's a diplomatic support effort behind it. And I think that's the more important part that's going to be what is brought to the table by their presence.
And the more potent diplomatic and political presence is not the European allies, but the Arab countries, obviously, that are participating. What kind of risks are those countries running domestically by agreeing to participate in these U.S. strikes?
They're going to make themselves targets to sympathizers of ISIS. What we saw in Algeria is a group that beheaded a French hostage, not because they have any kind of operational link to ISIS, but because they are sympathizers and sympathetic to what ISIS has done. And that could wreak havoc inside these countries. Now, many of these countries have robust domestic intelligence services, but they also have pretty bad track record on human rights. The concern is that now they're going to say, okay, well, we're participating in this coalition. That's going to draw the anger of a lot of their domestic constituents. And that means that these governments could then, in turn, crack down even further and really demonstrate a more abusive human rights record.
So as the U.S. says, we're looking at a years-long effort, which is astonishing given that our Congress isn't weighing in on it at all. It's my personal bugaboo about this. But if it is going to be a years-long effort, a years-long military effort, what should we watch for with countries like Saudi Arabia and Emirates and Jordan and these other countries? What should we watch for in terms of trying to figure out if they're also going to be there for the long haul, or if they essentially put an initial stamp on it for the initial diplomatic push, but they won't be able to sustain it?
Listen, as a U.S. citizen, what I want to see is, are these countries doing something beyond the military cooperation? Their military cooperation is, as I said, symbolic. Really, it's not going to make or break the fight. What is important are these countries doing something to reform their own societies, to show ISIS that, you know what, we're going to drain this ideology. We reject this ideology. Countries like Saudi Arabia that have an important religious role in the Muslim world, what are they doing publicly to condemn it? I'm not talking about a press release or a statement. What are they doing to reform their education system? What are they doing to reform a lot of their programming that goes on the air, that is spread across the Muslim world? These are the things that I would look for. Now, Americans aren't going to see that stuff. This is behind-the-scenes stuff. But this is the kind of stuff that we need to monitor and see these countries do in a systematic way that's going to over a generation, not a year. I mean, the operation may be a year, but ISIS is a generational problem. You look at where we were in 2001 when we went to war against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We look at where we are today in 2014. Al-Qaeda has spread to al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, in North Africa, in Yemen, and now we have this crisis in Syria and Iraq. It doesn't look good when you stand up at like 10,000 feet and look down at how this is spreading.
And, I mean, even more directly to the point, in southeastern Afghanistan today, reports of ISIS or ISIS-type militants embedding with the Taliban for a multiple beheadings attack in an area targeting the family members of police. You know, the American ground war in Afghanistan goes on. We think of this as a separate war, but it may all be turning into one. NBC News foreign correspondent Ayman Mohaldin. Ayman, it's great to see you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right, we got lots more ahead, including me stepping off the podium and letting somebody else do it better for a moment, plus best new thing tonight. Stay with us.